Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm Elizabeth Falter. I'm the Digital Media Specialist in the Department of English, and I will serve as your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us for Book Club. Today, we'll be discussing Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, selected by Department of English leaders and faculty. We are recording this webinar and we will share the video along with some additional resources with all of you via email. Attendees, you are muted and your video is off. If you have a comment or a question to add to the conversation, you can share by typing in the Q&A. Click Q&A at the bottom of your screen and you can submit your comment or question. We already have about 44 attendees on this webinar, so we will not be able to respond to every comment and question, but we will do our best to address as many as possible. A big thank you to Katherine Borland, Associate Professor of Comparative Studies and Director of the Center for Folklore Studies, and Andrea N. Williams, Associate Professor in the Department of English and Director of the Women's Place, for sharing their expertise with us today. Katherine and Andrea will get us started with some opening remarks about Their Eyes Were Watching God. We'll then open up the conversation to your questions and comments. So Andrea, take it away.
Great, thanks so much for inviting me to come and to talk a bit about a book that has mattered a lot to me. Is very important, just as well as Alice Walker ends up saying that the book is pretty important to her too. So I think by thinking about, with its provocative title, Their Eyes Were Watching God, this book has our hearts cherishing Hurston. Hurston enjoyed some recognition as a writer and folklorist during her life, but it's within the last 50 years that she's become a celebrated feminist icon, appreciated for the sass and the joy that she inscribes in her characters, especially Black women like Joanie Crawford. Hurston has now passed into the public imagination. She's often depicted sporting a jaunty hat emblazoned on the side of environmentally friendly book bags and t-shirts and coffee cups. And the name Zora is bestowed auspiciously onto babies by parents who own dog-eared copies of Their Eyes Were Watching God, or who recall some poignant phrase from the book that could just as easily have been said by their own grandmothers as by Nanny in the book. Hurston even lends her name to a local institution called Zora's House, a co-working and community space for women of color founded by Elsie Johnson, where people write together, heal, create, and organize. So today it's a great opportunity to think about what made this book so beloved. Their eyes were watching God, and we were watching ourselves through Janie. It's really the identification with the character, I think, that makes so many people love this book. Though imperfect and hardly a hero, Janie captures our attention because her self-discovery in this book is tender, gradual, it's interior, it's sometimes even bold without intending to be so. In the late 19th century, before Hurston, especially around the 1890s or so, Black women novelists, including Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Pauline Hopkins, Catherine Tillman, they were all foregrounding couples who were bonding mostly over their mutual meeting of the minds or a mutual love and investment in Black community building or other points of mutuality and sharing. But it was a little different when Hurston was writing about Janie's burgeoning sexual desire as she's resting there under the pear tree. And although now we may think that Janie's observation of these literal birds and bees still sounds pretty subtle in terms of talking about sexual desire, it really was a kind of breakthrough in thinking about what it was that Black women were capable of desiring for themselves, or what was considered the basis for a real marriage. So Hurston's attention to Janie's feelings in scenes like that one And I think that I am going to give in to the temptation to read a little bit just because that passage is so great. We really get a bit about her kind of thoughts and feelings and how she's processing that in the moment. She's stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun and the panting breath of the breeze when the inaudible voice of it came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of the bloom, the thousand sister calyxes arch to meet the love embrace and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from the root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage. She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain remorseless sweet that left her limp and languid. And I just love all the kind of nature scenery and the metaphors there. And as I'll mention a little bit later, I think that Hurston's metaphoric language is part of what sticks with us for so long with our engagement of the book. Hurston's attention to Janie's thoughts and her observations and her motives allows for us sometimes to even recognize more about her evolving psychology than the character herself does. But as Janie gains confidence, especially in her retort to Jody Starks one day in the store, readers can feel the pulsing of her childhood dreams, her true and new self coming to life. And so for readers who identify with Janie's character, she offers us hope to challenging the constraints of patriarchy and of class. I've been reading this book since I was a teenager. One of my copies, in fact, the copy that I'm reading from today is from 1987. It was the 50th anniversary edition with an introduction by Shirley Ann Williams, an author in her own right. And this was a copy that my older cousin had when she was in college classes and then passed down to me in the 1990s. And the book really rewards rereading at different stages of our lives. In my middle age now, thinking of mortality and legacy and the kind of brokenness of our world, I really tend to see every character a little differently with more grace and more sympathy or empathy than I used to. I think, for example, of Nanny, was a formerly enslaved woman who wanted to, as she says, preach a sermon about colored women sitting on high, but she found no pulpit for her. And I think, again, about the frustration and the angst of seeing the ambition of Black women and women of color frustrated by systemic injustices. And that it really registers with when she tells Janie a little bit later, put me down easy, I'm a cracked plate. So again, that identification of understanding that a little bit more registers with me now. I now see Nanny's actions of marrying off Janie as survivalist and born of love, even though their results really constrained and threatened to derail Janie's own dreams. So I want to talk just briefly about a few of the other themes that stand out to me as I reacquaint myself with the book each time. Again, just lavishing in the language in particular. I think I pick up Hurston's accent from her characters for about 2 weeks after I teach this book. And so again, every time it's fresh again, but I want to highlight just a few things. I especially appreciate Janie's friendship with Phoebe, the easiness between them. I mean, I value the possibility of Black women sharing their stories and their lives with one another. And this challenges the idea that when you have two female characters, they have to be foils for one another, and especially the possibility that they should be foils that are contending for the love of one romantic interest. So I appreciate that she challenges that and really gives friendship a kind of breadth of its own here. I'm also secondly paying greater attention here, maybe because of my own interest in questions of class division among African Americans, including in my first book, This time around in reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, I was thinking about, of course, the kind of class differences, but the additional pressures that put not only on Janie, but also on Jody or Joe, who was eager for the advantages of power in his small town, but who also felt constrained in his relationships and in his kind of interactions with others around him to be able to don that respectability in all of his encounters. And so it's really a powerful scene between Joe and Janie when she talks to him on his deathbed. And I had someone recently to say, but isn't that really cruel? I mean, she could just let the man die in peace, but she recognizes that this is her time and that he is now her audience, willing or at least needing to listen to her to a greater extent than he had when he himself was mobile and more in charge. So I'm thinking now again about class mobility, the pressures of respectability, and how class can mean different things in different locations, because we have to keep in mind that this is a small town and that its parameters then really give a sense of who is established or who's the center or who has respectability or so on among the inhabitants. The third thing that I've been thinking about with regard to the book is probably also one of the obvious ones, just thinking about Janie's journey, not only to herself, but also to different understandings of love and romance. So we see the disintegration of marriage in those first two relationships that she has with Logan Killix and then with Jody, and then her making a different choice in the third time of saying, I lived my grandmother's way, who thought that simply having a man who was a provider was a good model. And now I want to live a different way and make a different choice. She ends up indicating when she decides to go off with tea cake. So we do get her redefining love again, differently than, as I mentioned earlier, even some of the earlier Black women authors. But I have to thank my friend and colleague, Aisha Hardison, for also getting me to think about love in even broader ways in this book, that it's not only about romantic love, but also, of course, about Janie's self-love, but too also about the love of community. And that's what Jody has. And so I think we can't think about him as entirely heartless or only self-centered, that there really is a kind of love for community and desire to be able to provide embellishments and advancements in quality of life there. I'd also say that the townspeople have a kind of just uninhibited love of Black being, of being there together with a sense of authenticity that doesn't have to pretend for a white gaze. And in that regard, Hurston is really showing us a kind of appreciation of Black folk culture in a way that isn't meant only to be viewed performatively or even exploitatively in terms of as a consumer good or through appropriation. The final thing I'll mention then, I know Katie will be talking more about Hurston as a folklorist, but I just have to say again how much I love the language here. I mentioned earlier how the line about, set me down easy, I'm a cracked plate really stands out to me. But I find other places too that are rich in metaphor and in kind of intuition. So over in one of the later chapters where there's been a kind of disagreement between Janie and Jody is this moment where she finally starts to see both him and herself differently. And it reads, Janie stood where he left her for unmeasured time and thought. She stood there until something fell off the shelf inside herself. Then she went inside there to see what it was. And then a little bit further down, it says, she had an inside and an outside now, and certainly she knew how not, and suddenly she knew how not to mix them. And this idea about there was something inside of her that fell off the shelf. I realized that that phrase had passed into my personal lexicon, that it was the way that I began to personally describe grief or loss, or the awareness that comes from trauma, is that something falls on from the shelf inside yourself, and you have to go in and see what it is, and you come out transformed, understanding your inside and your outside. So as I said, again, I had started relying on that language in my imagery, in my metaphors, in my own kind of self-consciousness and awareness. And it took me coming back to the book again to say, oh yeah, I got that from Hurston, Cite Black Women. So again, those are those kinds of lines that really stick with us over time, and why I think so many people love the book. And so this is a book that really stays with you. And I'll say, like Janie's last thoughts in the book, we can call in our soul to come and see. Thanks.
All right, and next we will hear from Katherine Borland.
I believe I was on mute. I was just saying, Andrea, how wonderful it was to hear your sort of overview of the text, and I think I share many of your observations as well. And luckily, I'm going to be talking a bit more about the end than the beginning, so perhaps we'll be bookending pretty well here. So just to start, I think I found my way to Their Eyes Were Watching God through Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And when I did, I just consumed it in an afternoon. So there was something about the book that was just so enticing and so welcoming and so just new. This would have been in the early 1980s, I guess, when I was still in an English department, had not yet defected to the Folklore Institute at Indiana University. But when I did get to Indiana in 1986, I was amazed to find that Zora Neale Hurston was also a renowned folklorist of African-American life. And in fact, in my very first class, I didn't even really know what folklore was. We read Mules and Men, which is her collection of folklore from Eatonville, where she grew up, and Polk County, and also New Orleans. And we subsequently taught that book to students in the Introduction to Folklore classes as an exemplary text of regional folk culture, along with Americo Paredes's With His Pistol in His Hand. So those were two just terrific texts to teach with. And interesting that they were both, I mean, Mules and Men was written in 1935. With His Pistol in His Hand was written in 1959. So they were really, they weren't new, but they still resonated, and they did the work we needed them to do in those introductory classes. So if Alice Walker kind of gave a new life to Their Eyes Were Watching God and Zora Neale Hurston's other literary works, there was another text in the mid-1990s that kind of did the same for Zora Neale Hurston's work as a folklorist and anthropologist. So in the mid-1980s, there was a collection called Writing Culture that announced itself as a kind of paradigm shifting anthropological collection that was going to center on anthropology that's experiments in writing, but that totally ignored generations of women anthropologists who had, of course, fallen out of the canon, and their experiments in writing. And so Women Writing Culture, a book edited by Ruth Behar and Deborah Gordon, resurrected those anthropological foremothers. And among them were Ella Deloria, who was, like Zora, a novelist and a collector, Elsie Clues Parsons, Ruth Landis, Margaret Mead, and of course, Zora Neale Hurston. Interesting in the essay, kind of resurrecting Hurston as an experimental writer of anthropology, Graciela Hernandez talks a lot about the way in Mules and Men, Zora is very self-conscious about her perspective as an anthropologist. She uses this metaphor at the very beginning of the book. I was going back to my home community, but now I had the spyglass of anthropology. So this idea of anthropology being a distanced and detached kind of way of understanding community life. But in that same sort of introductory framing, Zora contrasts that persona with just good old Zora, the prodigal daughter come home. She's very, very self-conscious. She includes herself in her narrative, and she provides, and she becomes a character along with all of the other people in that text who are sharing their stories and life ways with her. One of the interesting things about reading Mules and Men alongside Their Eyes Were Watching God is the way in which both texts kind of traverse the same territory. In Mules and Men, Zora Neale Hurston, the anthropologist, comes back down to Eatonville from Columbia University in New York City. She spends some time there, and then she's off again to Polk County in search of bluesmen. And Polk County, of course, is the Everglades. So like Janie, she goes south to Eatonville and then south again to this other place. But what's interesting about that Polk County episode is the way in which Zora and Janie really have very contrasting experiences. For Janie, of course, this is the chapter in her life where she is most fulfilled and most kind of integrated in her community, right? She's no longer sitting outside or away or apart or above. She's right in there doing things with the other people of this community, and particularly with Tea Cake. She goes there for love, and that love has changed her, because now she doesn't make the distinction between staying in the house and doing the work of the house as opposed to helping, for instance, her first husband, Logan Killix, with the work of the men. Now she's happy to go fishing and plant beans along with everybody else. For Zora, the trip to Polk County is quite a bit more difficult. She arrives and people are very suspicious of her. She's got a nice dress on, she's driving a car. And so, of course, they think she's somehow related to the law, and she has to make up a lie in order to be accepted. So she says she's a bootlegger's woman, and that explains, her relative prosperity. But she also talks about this area. She's going to the turpentine camps and hanging out at the Dukes. And she talks about it as a very rough and violent place. Not easily accepted into this community. And then even with the lie, she ends up getting into a knife fight with a jealous woman and has to flee. It's quite a different portrait from the portrait that exists in Their Eyes Were Watching God, where Janie is really, the people are warm and friendly and interesting and open and fun-loving. Tea Cake is a gambler and he's a guitar picker, but he's not violent. So we see this very different depiction of what we can imagine is the least privileged of the African American community. So I think that's kind of an interesting, like the novelist does one thing, whereas the ethnographer maybe does something else. And I wanted to kind of back up a little bit and say both of these stories, they're written not very far apart. I think there's 2 years between them, 1935 and 1937, are based in part on work that Hurston did in 1927, about 10 years, 8 to 10 years earlier, when she got a fellowship to go down and do research, particularly with people who had experienced slavery. And I think this is another interesting sort of background to how the story in Their Eyes Were Watching God evolves. Janie is, in essence, the child of a formerly enslaved woman, right? It's her grandmother, but the relationship is there. Hurston was very concerned to make sure that there was a record of these people's experience, since they continued to be marginalized in the 1920s. She went for 3 months and interviewed a man who was one of the few survivors of the Clotilde, which was the last slave trading ship that brought people from Africa to the New World. In 1860, 40 something years after that trade had been ruled illegal, they were still doing it. This individual, Cudjoe Lewis, could narrate a life story that starts in Africa, experienced the Middle Passage, experienced slavery, and then post-slavery, the founding of Africatown, a town of Africans who recreated their community in Alabama. So she was doing this work. I think she was very cognizant of the importance of documenting people's experiences that, in another generation would not be possible. So that first trip to Alabama and Florida provided her with a great deal of the material that ends up in both of these books. And she wrote a very traditional collection of tales that existed in manuscript form, but she couldn't get anyone interested in it. The interesting thing for me about these tales, which were then put into this book, Every Tongue GottaConfess, which is a lovely phrase again. This is published in 2001. So it was left in a box for, decades and decades before someone was able to recognize it and recognize its worth and get it published. The story of Cudjoe Lewis is also now available. It was published in 2018. So more of her documentary work is coming out now. There's also, interestingly enough, the folklorists have a little listserv, and so different kinds of materials come across our desks every day, people finding interesting things. And Hurston, when she went on these trips, not only recorded people and wrote down field notes and took photographs, she also took film footage. And so we have some footage of the visit to Cudjoe Lewis and his farm that someone sent me randomly a week and a half ago. So anyway, she's a wonderful novelist and has been rightly recognized as a feminist inspiration, but she was also a serious scholar who's just collected all sorts of things that are worthy of our attention and concern. I guess I would end just by saying, towards the end of the novel, there are a couple of scenes in Their Eyes Were Watching God that really stand out for me in terms of their just sheer dramatic power. And the first one is with Janie holding on to a cow's tail in the middle of a flood and a rabid dog about to attack her. I mean, that's just such a riveting image. And then not long later, not so much time later, having to shoot the love of her life, Tea Cake, because he's unfortunately been bitten by that dog, and the irony of being in that situation. So I would kind of leave us with that, with those images, and hope that we can have some conversation about the many themes and treasures in this text. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Just a reminder to attendees, you can submit a question or comment by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and typing in your comment or question. So our first question comes from Susan and is in reference to, Katie, what you were just talking about. And Susan asks, are you referring to Their Eyes Were Watching God as folklore, or other works by Hurston, or both?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was unclear. So she wrote this text, Mules and Men, right? Which is how would we, it's an experimental ethnography, actually, of her time. She returns to Eatonville, goes to Polk County, and then goes to New Orleans to study under some of the hoodoo masters in that town. This was written in 1935. Their Eyes Were Watching God is 1937. And so the texts, one is folklore, one is a collection in which Zora Neale Hurston narrates her own journey, and the other is a novel in which she invents this character, Janie, that we all love, right? But they're going to the same places and they're meeting the same kinds of people. And even some of the woofing that goes on in the novel when, for instance, the people making fun of the guy with the mule, the old, skinny mule, that's happening in both of these texts. So there's a lot of crossover between the two. I hope that clarifies.
I was about to say, I think that also points us to the episodic structure of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Sometimes when almost the community as a whole becomes a character. And one might think, okay, if this story is about Janie and her experience, why do we need to have this detour of them going to the game or going to bury the animal and all like this? But again, we really want to see both how she is embedded in communities and how she's not, right? Because there's the contrast of those times that she can't participate in this kind of swapping lies, as they call this storytelling that really is part of the kind of intimate exchange between people in the community. And I think that's a really good point, Katie, about how often she does rely on some of her core archival or kind of materials that she's collecting and then repurpose them in different ways, whether it is in plays that she's writing, in short stories that she's writing. We see, again, the repeated kinds of character types, sometimes with different names, but telling the same story. So we do get a sense of how she's really making the most of both her time and her experience. I mean, even Their Eyes Were Watching God was written in a very condensed time, I think about 6 weeks or so, while she was in Haiti on a Guggenheim, where she was actually supposed to be writing another book or researching for another book. So we really see her repurposing those experiences to draw on them in multiple different ways.
Thank you. Our next question. For those who love Zora Neale Hurston's work, are there contemporary authors whose publications embody themes or styles similar to Hurston that you can recommend for future reading?
I think if we were to think about Hurston's relationship with Southern vernacular culture or Southern folk culture, we would especially say people like Alice Walker, The Color Purple, in terms of that as an epistolary novel written as letters, but written with Seeley's kind of natural speech patterns there. And then we know the line from Alice Walker, many people say, goes next to something like Sapphire's Push, again, and thinking about just writing in different styles to represent people's natural language. I'd also say, so many people have proclaimed themselves as inheritors of Hurston's style, even referring to her as a kind of foremother. And I always think that's interesting, given her child's free state. But thinking about her in terms of that way, Shirley Ann Williams, that I mentioned earlier, as writing the kind of beginning prologue for this book, in addition to Gail Jones and Corregidora in the 1970s or so. If we were to think more about just her emphasis on either Southern writing or even on representations of kind of Black love and romance and its fragility or its vulnerabilities, I would think maybe even something like Tayari Jones's American Marriage, where you're seeing the kind of slow disintegration of a marriage and a journey into self for the female protagonist in particular. So those are a couple of places to pick up. Not everyone uses language as skillfully as Hurston does, in terms of with a deep respect for vernacular, as opposed to in a kind of lazy way that's just dropping the G's off the ends of verbs. But I think that there are some other people who have a sense of respect for some of the intents that she was sharing there.
Thank you. So our next comment comes from Susan. And again, just a reminder, if you want to submit a question or comment, just click Q&A at the bottom of your screen and you can type in your question or comment. But Susan says, this was my second reading of the book, and I saw it this time as a romance novel about a woman who lived in a different time and place. As Janie matured, her thoughts about romance changed in ways that have universal meaning for all women. Hurston tells the story in a lyrical way. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and this isn't an untroubled romantic narrative, right? As I mentioned earlier, the characters here are still fallible. I mean, I think even in what is often held up as this kind of idealized love that crosses the boundaries of age for Tea Cake and Janie, there's a troubling thread of domestic abuse that happens there as well, that I am not sure that initial audiences or earlier audiences would have taken as seriously as what appears to us now. And so I think those are some of the ways that we think, yes, this is partly about a romance, but there are also some things to critique in that romance. And that's why I think it's as important for us to think about this as Janie really learning to love and acknowledge and define herself. Now, that happens to be through the encouragement of a often uninhibited partner with Tea Cake, who encourages her to experiment with some of these different things. But in that way, we might think of him as a coach as much as a partner. And then bring that back around to, as I said, those final lines that are about her soul coming out to see what's there and what's left of the life for her to make.
Yeah, I think just to add, I remember kind of stumbling over the episode where the first episode where they leave Eatonville, and Janie and Tea Cake are staying somewhere, and he goes off and takes her money and does not come back. And yeah, I didn't remember. It made me feel divided about him. And of course, she forgives him in the end because he explains he's just been, rousting around. He's never had money before, but it did seem quite, I don't know. I just got a bad feeling about Tea Cake, right? And then, in the end, Hurston, the novelist, redeems him by Janie insisting that she needs to go wherever he's going, right? And that there's no place that's too undignified for her to follow him, right? And so he agrees not to leave her at home again, right? That's the outset. But he still took her money and gambled it and, had an adventure without her and without telling her. I mean, that does not seem like a perfect partner.
So I think in that regard, those are the ways that we have taken some of the best of the novel, especially those great lines like I cited earlier where, Nanny says, I wanted to preach a sermon about colored women sitting on high, this idea. And that's what is drawing feminists in to say, yes, this is about women's empowerment and, making unconventional choices. But we also have to recognize the ways that even Janie remains tethered to those remnants of patriarchal understandings of money, of her body, of her position in or outside of the home and in relationship to domesticity. So those are some of the areas that are probably more troubling to us now than they might have initially been to some earlier readers.
So I know, Andrea, you brought up the presence of Phoebe and the friendship between Janie and Phoebe as opposed to the foils, them being foils. And I'm wondering if you can talk, or either or both of you can talk about the narrative of this story, the fact that it's told as a story to Phoebe, and we sort of have that frame on both sides, and yet it's also told in third person rather than first person from Janie. I'm wondering if you can talk a little about that.
Yeah, I think there was such a history of first person narrative of people who have been formerly enslaved in the 19th into the early 20th century. And even pretty late into the 20th century, some of those still being found, as Katie points out, with Barracoon and some of those narratives of enslaved people that were embedded into WPA works, reports, and so on. So there was a really strong history of there being first person narratives, but there was also the risk with that of many of those early narratives flattening the characters to their experience of struggle or oppression, especially for listening, even well-intended anti-slavery audiences, for example, right? I think about how some of the orators like Frederick Douglass and so on were told, okay, leave the philosophizing to us as the white abolitionists, and you just tell your story about how painful this is. And so I think for Hurston to have a third person narrator is putting the history more into a fictional space than a first person memoir space, and yet allowing for the evolution of self that often is described best in first person still to come through by having a more intimate or friendly auditor or someone who's listening in there in terms of her audience, being Phoebe. So I often go back and read the book and think, okay, how long was Phoebe actually over there, right? We have to imagine this was a conversation that went on for a while, but in that way, I would say that the friendship then is also anticipating the friendship between Sula and Nell and Toni Morrison's Sula. So that might be another way to think about some people who are picking up on Hurston's themes as well there. Maybe taking this in a different kind of direction, and Kate, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on this too. I think this time around too, on the backside of Hurricane Katrina and Harvey and all of these, the kind of impact of ecological disaster stands out a lot more to me now. And in that way, I was thinking, about what she's doing there, getting our attention maybe to some of these kinds of questions about environmental humanities that we might entertain now.
Yeah. And, when I was reading it this time, I thought, was there a flood? Right? I mean, I thought, is this something that happened that she is, kind of recuperating in fiction? And I don't know, I didn't do the research to find out whether this is based on anything. But boy, does it sound similar to what's the lake in I can't, I'm not remembering.
Pontchartrain or
Pontchartrain, yeah. And the fact that, like it just reminded me so much of when that flooded. And so, yeah, it's interesting, but it also gives her this wonderful opportunity to engage in a kind of mythical narration as, different groups of people and animals start, some are more in the know than others, right? Some of them can smell it in the wind, right? And others are, and then she and Tea Cake and their friend are just kind of laughing it off as not being important, right? So there is this, again, this sense of it moving into that, the flood narrative, like the biblical flood, right? And
this comes across still, as you said, with her kind of references to biblical tropes or to creationism a number of times throughout this, is a bit more lyrical than I think of Jasmine Ward's use of kind of the hurricane and Salvage the Bones, where we get this real grittiness as a result of hurricane or flooding or so on. And so, yeah, that's really interesting just to kind of think about those two in relation as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's an article in that, right? Be thinking about how does she dramatize that that weather event, right? Because again, I mean, just the imagery in it is so stark and shocking. I mean, she's on a piece of metal roofing when the wind picks her up and throws her into the water, right? You know, like all of these things are happening that I don't know. I just had a very filmic kind of imagination of the text in this reading this time.
That's going to drive us back to look at the 2005 film adaptation with Halle Berry and Mike.
Do that. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Michael. Can you compare Their Eyes Were Watching God with The Grapes of Wrath? Am I wrong in believing that Hurston is as good as Steinbeck in relation to these two novels?
I'd certainly say that Hurston is, this is going back to a question that I think is a larger question, but that perhaps I gestured to a bit in saying it's been in the last 50 years in particular that people have paid greater attention to Hurston. I think we have to remember that the very literary, the sense of a literary canon and an American literary canon that values the work of people of color, of writers from different ethnic backgrounds and of different styles of writing is more recent. And so the very question itself is based a bit on holding up Grapes of Wrath as an undeniable canon maker or classic, and then trying to fit Hurston into that. But I think more contemporarily, people are thinking about how do we need to explode some of the very ideas on which the canon was based, of thinking about what the great American novel is or who can write the great American novel. So I think both of these authors are certainly very skilled in thinking about particular demographics of people, their hardships, their joys, and especially given us experiences of working class characters. That much I would say that they do have in common, although they're sometimes coming from different angles or writing from different perspectives, especially given how much here Hurston is centering that female experience to think about what does not simply poverty, but even the goodness of Janie being fairly middle class in their kind of community, how is she just as constrained by that in some ways as well? So I'd say, yes, read both and read with a kind of openness to how both writers are thinking about these different racially differentiated populations of people experiencing working class experience in, kind of early to mid America, 20th century America.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think one of the things about this novel is that she moves from, we have class in every moment, right? In her early life, she's participating in the plantation, right? In the sense that she is raised with these white children and doesn't realize she's Black until somebody takes a photograph. So, there's a way in which it's a very varied portrait, right? So we have Joe Starks and his, lamp lighting ceremony in the new Eatonville, but we also have, someone who's, too poor to get his own cane, right? And so is stealing cane from someone else. And really, I think a narrator who condemns those, class distinctions at every point where someone is trying to establish themselves as above or distinct from, the narrator seems to be kind of challenging that, right? Doesn't support it. So observing without supporting.
Katherine, I'm glad you brought up that scene about the photograph, because it goes back to your point about the kind of documentary nature of recording Black culture that Hurston was interested in. But I also think, we need to connect that scene more seriously with Janie's awakening or awareness of herself, because it's easy to think of that as a kind of, naivete. But I think as much as she feels freed in some ways from racial identification, her grandmother feels very connected to the constraints of that, even in saying, the Black woman, or she says the colored woman, is the mule of the world.
Right.
So I think, we already see some of the experience of that next generation of kind of freedom or a different kind of self-awareness that Janie is feeling just by having arrived at that age without recognizing that she was a little Black girl. But that also harkens back to some slave narratives as well, in which many of the children, people like Harriet Jacobs, will say they didn't know that they were enslaved until something in particular happens. And it tells us about how really unnatural and socially constructed these very categories of who's enslaved, who's not enslaved, who's a Black child, who's not a Black child are, and they don't come natural to kids as they're growing up.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left. So in those couple minutes, Katherine and Andrea, love for you to give us some closing remarks on the novel and why it endures.
Well, it's very well written. It's got wonderful characters. And as I said, there are these moments of, just the imagery just stands out so strongly. I think, and I would also go back to this point where Hurston is really experimenting with, how do I tell this story? How do I give voice to this experience that I know exists among people who have been denigrated, who have not been able to tell their story themselves, right? And she is a romantic of vernacular culture, right? Like the Polk County is more authentic than Eatonville, right? And so I think, but I think that she's in a sense writing in defense of something, right? Writing to underscore the humanity of people who have, for various reasons, women, people of color who have been dehumanized. And so I think we need more stories like that. That's why it endures.
I think it endures for some of the reasons that I mentioned early, in terms of a particular reading style that it invites of identification, of you being able to say, if I were Janie, or I've been through this similar situation of coming to an awareness. And that's why it's really great to read for college classes, because it's at that stage where students might be feeling, if not from a grandma or a parent, maybe some other kinds of societal pressures of, this is what you should do. Get your degree, get married, have your children, do this, do that. And you see Janie straining against that to try to imagine a different, there's a great line about, since her first dream was dead, she became a woman, as though those two things of dreaming and adulthood have to be antithetical. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's really useful and appealing for people at transitional points in their lives, like for students. And then as I said, I just think so much of the language is beautiful. I went back through and started highlighting how many Black feminist writers have like used lines from Hurston as the titles of their books or essays. So we just see how it's a gift that keeps giving.
Wonderful. Well, a big virtual round of applause to Katherine and Andrea for sharing your time and expertise with us here today. And thank you so much to everyone who was able to join us this afternoon. We appreciate your time and all of your thoughtful questions. We hope you can join us next month on March 24th. We'll be discussing The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. We'll send out a recording of this webinar in the next couple of weeks. And everyone stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you soon. Have a good one.